Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast. Yesterday we looked at the Iberian maritime empires. Today we'll be looking more closely at the maritime empires created by the Northern Europeans, particularly the English, the French, and the Dutch. But before we get to that, one thing I want to point out. Yesterday we focused almost exclusively on the territory that is Mesoamerica and South America. But remember that the Caribbean is also a site of intense competition over colonies, especially because its ability to grow sugar, coffee, and tobacco, three immensely profitable cash crops. And if you notice, everybody seems to be scrambling for any island that they can get in the Caribbean. The Spanish, British, French, Dutch. If you notice real closely, even one island that is controlled by the Danish. And all of that competition, as I mentioned yesterday, has an effect on the sugar production in Portuguese Brazil. But what I want to focus more on now is what's going on in North America. And the bottom line is, at the time, North America was considered kind of a backwater. It was not important at all to the other Europeans. It was like the leftovers that the Spanish and the Portuguese didn't really get. The English and the French, for example, were far more interested in their holdings in the Caribbean, which they called the West Indies, because of its profit in cash crops. And the Dutch, as we'll see, were far more interested in what was going on in their East Indies holdings, the territory that will become known as Indonesia. And so, in the context, it's kind of forgotten about, and largely the English will take the lead. A turning point in that, if you recall, though, is when they defeated the Spanish Armada. The Spanish were trying to basically prevent the English from having any sort of colonies in the New World. But when they defeat the Spanish Armada, who at the time was largely seen as having the most powerful fleet in the world, that then opens up the door to colonies, beginning first with the Jamestown colony and then colonies thereafter. But what's happening in North America in terms of its demographics is very different than what's going on in Latin America, in Spanish America and Portuguese Brazil, for example. First of all, the French are there and they occupy a large territory, but they are almost exclusively single men who are trappers. They're there to capture animals for their fur, and very few of them are there with wives and families. In fact, many of them will end up marrying native women. On the other hand, the English are settling down. They are moving there permanently, and this is a significant difference. Similarly, in terms of the labor, then, most of the labor, especially for the English settlers, are indentured servants. These are people who agree to be laborers for a set period of time, say 7 years, after which point they are freed from their debt, their bondage. But most of those workers are used for agriculture in places that had not had much agriculture before. So they're actually working in fields, but in fields for producing food as opposed to cash crops. It's also the case in North America compared to Latin America. There are far few native peoples. We know that, Cahokia was a large urban center in the area, what's now around St. Louis, but generally speaking, North America was less densely populated than Mesoamerica and the Andean region, for example. And initially, there just weren't that many Africans brought over for slave labor. Now, as a consequence of this, you have more white families, the English settlers who are whole families, and you have fewer Native Americans and fewer Africans. And whereas the social hierarchy that emerges in Portuguese Brazil and Spanish America is focused on different types of mixing, the system that emerges in North America becomes known as the one drop rule. And the one drop rule says this: you are not white if you have any blood that is not white. If you have one drop of African blood, you are considered black. If you have one drop of native blood, you are considered native. The like very specific subcastes that emerge in Latin America definitely do not happen in North America. You're either white or you're not. It's that simple. Now, in addition, there are just fewer natural resources in North America compared to Latin America. In the north, there's fur, there's fish, which is immensely valuable at this time in Europe, also timber. Much of Western Europe, in particular, has almost been completely deforested, and so timber is an especially valuable resource at that point. In the southern part of North America, people quickly realize they can grow cotton and tobacco. But of course, those are cash crops on plantations, require a labor force. So at that point, then, that's when North America starts importing slaves from Africa. And so by 1700 in North America, about 23% of the population are actually African slaves. Not the same as what happens in Spanish Brazil, obviously, where quickly they become greater than 50% of the population. But we can see that percentage of the population increasing in North America. Moreover, in North America, they tend to follow more like what's happening in Northern Europe at the time, specifically focusing on manufacturing. And as we've seen, and as we'll see again in the Spanish American colonies and Portuguese Brazil, manufacturing was definitely not a particular focus for them, but it was very much so in the English colonies in North America. Changing family structures, though, is something that's a little bit different. One of the things that happens in the English colonies, especially in North America, is there is a boom in family size. Couples having way more children in North America. At the same time, in Western Europe, the trend is dramatically in the opposite direction. Families having fewer and fewer children. This is a really kind of a fascinating topic that I'm not sure we'll have time to go into any more detail, but I find it as really interesting thing. The other thing going on is the Protestant Reformation is taking hold in Northern Europe as opposed to Southern Europe, where, in the Iberian Peninsula and the Italian Peninsula, they are staying Catholic by and large. And so this is something we'll come back to when we get into the cultural transformations that are happening at the same time. North America, by and large, will become more associated with Protestantism, whereas Latin America will become associated with Catholicism. Now, I'm going to briefly throw this out here because we'll come back to it next week. But it's important to recognize that early on, particularly for the French, everything was focused on the fur trade. And it's interesting if you take a look at this image, which we'll look at more closely next week, the territories that are occupied by the French and even in what's now Canada, the British, are important to them because of the fur trade and the ability to get the fur back to Europe. But I also want you to notice Russia is getting in on this action as well. In fact, setting up fur trapping settlements in what is now Alaska and moving into North America as well. So that's something we'll come back to and look at more closely later on. But now I want to talk about the Dutch Empire for just one moment. And if you notice on this particular map, particularly the areas that are the light green, many of those territories used to be controlled, if not occupied, by the Portuguese. And the Dutch are coming up with a very interesting strategy here. So let's look at what they're trying to do in Asia and America, particularly. First of all, by 1700, what they've done is they basically knock off the places that the Portuguese had controlled. The Portuguese Empire is in a steep, steep, steep decline, and they're not able to defend their ports, and so the Portuguese just take them by force because they can. The Cape of Good Hope obviously is a very important one, the southern tip of Africa, that stopping point between Europe and the Indian Ocean. Malacca, obviously another important one. So those choke points that were the focus of the trade post empire the Portuguese were trying to build, those are all taken by the Dutch because the Portuguese can't really defend them. However, oh, and then even briefly the coastline of Brazil, which again, the reason for that is they're not interested in producing the sugar because what they are focusing on is the shipping. They're making their money as the transport guys, moving stuff around. This is the case in Asia where they're not actually producing anything. They're just taking a cut of all of the goods that are moved around in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. They're making their money as the transport guys. But they are monopolizing trade in certain spices. Again, not necessarily initially in the production of those spices, but certain spices, they're the only ones who are shipping them. And so if you want those spices, at some point you're going to have to pay the Dutch in order to get them. They're much less concerned about what's going on in the Americas. The cases they do care about involve sugar and tobacco, but again, the big idea for the Dutch is they don't take territory in Portuguese Brazil because they want to produce the sugar. They want the coastline because they want to make their money by shipping the sugar. Now, their approach then is really where we start to see the emergence of a global maritime empire. Because what the Dutch are really trying to do is not necessarily take over huge territories, but create a giant, almost global trade network that is just exclusively their shipping. That's how they're making their money. A very interesting approach. Now, let's look at the general trend of the Northern Europeans in Asia, but let's compare that to what the Iberians are doing in Asia. By the way, CF is an old Latin uh, abbreviation that means compared to. What are the Iberians doing in Asia? Well, the Portuguese tried to set up a trading post empire with the Cartaz pass system as their way to make money, and that just didn't work out. The Spanish actually take over the Philippines, and they're going to try to manage it directly themselves. It's controlled by the crown, by the Spanish, by the king of Spain, I should say. Instead, what the Northern Europeans do in Asia is they're going to rely on these things called joint stock companies. And this is a really important concept. Here's how this works. A joint stock company is given a royal charter. That is to say, they're given a grant by the king of the country, and they represent the crown in markets abroad. However, they are not owned by the state. They are not managed by the state. They are privately owned companies that are given a charter by the king. They represent the king, but they are solely focused on profit. They are privately owned companies who go into business to make money. So the strategy for Northern Europeans is, instead of the state trying to manage this, let us grant a company, a joint stock company, exclusive privileges from our country and have them figure out how to make a profit, and then we'll get a slice of that back. It's a very interesting system that is quite effective in Asia for those who follow it, because that then means they can focus on shipping, they can focus on trying to build monopolies in certain markets, and it doesn't require like a wholesale takeover of territory and then being managed by a state that's literally halfway around the world. This is a system that works very, very well for the Northern Europeans in Asia. Three cases that are starting to emerge that we'll look at more closely in the next time period. The earliest of these joint stock companies is created by the Dutch East India Company. They are focused in a territory that will become known as Indonesia, the part of Southeast Asia where the spices are, most of the spices are produced, and that's what they're going to focus on. Eventually, though, in the next time period, that is to say after 1750, we'll come back to this. Eventually, though, the Dutch government just takes over all of Indonesia and makes it part of their giant empire. Similarly, the British East India Company is formed, and they get a royal charter, and they're going to focus on India, where initially they are making arrangements, they are negotiating deals with the um, Mughal Empire. But again, as we'll see in the next time period, at some point, the relationships between the British East India Company and the Mughal Empire are so bad that the British just take it over and India becomes officially part of the British Empire. France is seeing what is happening and they want a slice of that action, but they're very late to the party. Nonetheless, they do create a East India Company of their own, although as we'll see, it doesn't last very long. They go in a different route then, and they take over a territory in Southeast Asia that they will then name Indochina. The point here is this, though. The whole approach to what the Northern Europeans are doing in Asia is very different than what the Iberians tried. The Portuguese, their trading post empire system did not succeed very well. The Spanish are controlling and occupying the Philippines as a colony. That is working to some extent, but as we'll see, that also is leading to problems. But this idea of a privately owned company that represents the state but is pursuing activities in the name of profit is the wave of the future, if you will, particularly with European involvement in Asia. So by the time we get to about 1700, then what we've seen is a dramatic change throughout the world. In the New World, the Spanish American territories and the Portuguese Brazil, the Caribbean is where all sorts of Europeans are trying to get involved. In North America, the French and the British are sort of occupying large territory. The Dutch will take over this area that ports of which used to be controlled by the Portuguese, Spanish, Philippines over here. And literally the world has transformed in the span of just about 200 years. I want to thank you guys for your attention. I look forward to seeing you in class. Bye.